I love having an array of watercolors to choose from, but sometimes having too many options on our palettes can be more overwhelming than not having enough. This series focuses on extremely limited palettes of just 2 or 3 colors and how they work together in a painting. This is the third video of the series, and today we are going to be exploring a bright triad of colors: New Gamboge, Quinacridone Rose, and Cobalt Teal. As always for this series, my patrons have access to a survey to let me know which of the palettes they're most excited to see, and I consult my list each time that I pick a new pair or trio. This specific triad was suggested by Cameron Lamb Composer on Instagram, with a similar triad also being suggested by another patron named Corbin. Alrighty, so when I pulled my colors for this study, I was in for more troubleshooting than I realized. I'll go into more depth about that shortly, but first let's take a quick look at each of the pigments that I'm swatching. The first color is Daniel Smith's single pigment version of New Gamboge, PY 153. Put a pin in that for just a moment and we will circle back. New Gamboge was named after the original Gamboge made from NY24. This natural version was derived from the resin of Garcinia trees found in Asia, namely Cambodia, for which it is named. However, NY24 is both fugitive, meaning it fades in sunlight, and toxic when ingested, which led to its overall disuse. To replace it using modern pigments, PY 153 became the popular substitute, which was commonly called New Gamboge. Unfortunately for artists, the lack of demand for PY 153 in the industrial and automotive industries also led to this beloved artist color to be discontinued as well. Usually, I try not to use discontinued pigments in informative videos like this, but I didn't realize or remember that PY 153 had been discontinued when I pulled the pans for this video. So this is the single pigment version of the discontinued pigment, but many brands have formulated additional hues to again approximate this color. Next up, we have the unproblematic Quinacridone Rose made from PV19. This version is Red Rose Deep from Vinci, but any pink-leaning PV19, opposed to the red or violet versions, will do just fine. Finally, we arrive at our other problematic member of this initial swatching, Daniel Smith's version of Cobalt Turquoise. It may not look very offensive right now, but just you wait for that second layer. In the meantime, keep in mind that Cobalt Teal can be made from either PG50 like Daniel Smith's version here, or PP28 like M. Graham's version. Whichever pigment you're using, we are going for the lighter, brighter version of this cobalt color rather than the deeper turquoise that we used in the first video of this series. In our first row of color mixing, we have New Gamboge paired with Quinacridone Rose. While using a redder pigment like PR254 instead of this pinker pigment would make for more intense oranges, using Quinacridone Rose makes for more transparent mixes, and trust me, these oranges are still plenty vivacious. Since New Gamboge is already a very warm pigment, the range between these two colors spans between Kraft Macaroni and Cheese to Fire Engine Red. The second row is Quinacridone Rose and Cobalt Teal. This chart is still using that Daniel Smith version, and you'll start to see some of the textural concerns that I don't love about this version. The granulation is incredibly heavy, bordering on clumpy. While this could absolutely be useful and lovely in certain applications, I don't find it to be the most versatile option. Generally speaking, Quinacridone Rose and Cobalt Teal make for some very bright red violets, softer violets, and deep periwinkles. The Cobalt Teal and the New Gamboge make for bright sea greens, lively spring greens, and more muted yellow greens as we get closer to those warm yellows. I was pretty unhappy with how the swatching came out due to the dense granulation patterns, so instead of doing just one color wheel to fill a page like I've done before, I decided to try out 2 more options before starting the painting studies just to make sure that I was using a version that I would enjoy. Circle 1 is the original triad with Daniel Smith's PG50, Circle 2 is Schmincke's Cobalt Turquoise, also made from PG50, and Circle 3 is M. Graham's version made from PB28. Schmincke's version is the lightest and liveliest of the bunch with a moderate amount of granulation, but it is so much less clumpy than Daniel Smith's, making for a more pleasant painting experience. M. Graham's version is the one I am most familiar with as it has lived on my main studio palette since very early on in my watercolor adventures. After mixing the additional color wheels, as well as playing around with those darkest neutrals that I could achieve with each triad, I went back to old reliable M. Graham for the rest of this painting session. Before we get to those paintings, here are also some of those quick comparisons for the new Gamboge that I promised you. The first swatch on the left is Daniel Smith's single pigment of PY 153 that I'm using throughout this video. Without looking up any pigment information, I went through all of my palettes and chose Sennelier's Indian Yellow as the closest visual match that I could find, which then made a lot of sense once I looked up its pigment information, as it is made with both PY 153 and PY 154. Sennelier does still stock both this color and a single pigment version made from PY 153 called Sennelier Yellow Light. I also wanted to share some other options and let you know that it's not super important to have the exact colors that I'm working with today. I also tried my hand at a quick custom mix using Daniel Smith's Lemon Yellow made from PY 175 and Winsor & Newton's Transparent Orange, DDP or PO 107 depending on your sources. Now we are finally ready to move on from the pigment semantics and start painting. However, keeping aboard that struggle bus that I've been on this whole episode, this first eye study did not go according to plan, but I can tell you all the reasons why. First off, the sketch is a lot smaller than my previous eye studies in this series. My additional color wheels pushed onto the second page, and I was really trying to keep the entire study to a single spread. I could have done it larger, but this is how it turned out. Secondly, I went with a really harsh angle on the eye itself from the side, which is great for anatomy practice, but less ideal I have found for playing with those broad strokes of color and really see how these colors mingle with each other. And third, I thought I grabbed one brush but accidentally grabbed another, and by the time I realized, I figured I would just commit to this one. This Tintoretto has a pretty blunt tip, and while the softness of the brush is generally nice, it doesn't have the spring that I would have preferred for this particular study. In this study, I tried to keep the colors I was using somewhat close in hue to those base pigments. The shadow tones did require all three pigments used pretty strongly together, and let me tell you, while this limited palette struggles to make really solid dark values because they're all inherently light valued pigments, all three of the colors that I used are equally strong bullies, meaning they have very high tinting strengths on the palette. A little of each color goes a long way, and your color mixes might shift pretty drastically while you're mixing them. Since this first attempt didn't go according to plan and I didn't feel fully secure with the palette of colors I was using, I decided to do a second study in what little space I had left on the page. I switched to the Vinci Casaneo brush, which is what I meant to grab for the first study, as it has a much finer tip and is a bit more versatile. Whereas the first eye study focused on those primary colors, I thought I'd see what we could do with the secondary colors in this one. I chose a new forward-facing reference, used diluted orange mixtures for the skin, violets for the shadows, and green for the iris. For both studies, I switched to the Silver Brush Golden Natural Ultraround for the final touches. Not only does this brush have an incredibly fine tip in terms of thickness, it also holds a lot less water. That means that we can get our darkest mixtures even more concentrated so that they can appear nearly black on the page when surrounded by all the lighter tones. With that, I finally felt like I had a better grasp on the mixing capabilities of this palette, and I was ready to move forward to my final study. Before we dive into the painting, I did want to thank all of you for your very kind words on my last video about Cricket's passing. My patrons expressed interest in having prints and stickers of her for our July artwork, so prints and stickers of this sweet girl are available on Patreon through July 31st. To receive one, you can sign up for any of the tiers that receive physical rewards, and keep in mind international patrons are welcome at no additional charge. Thank you so much for your support, and now back to the video. The first two videos in this series were pretty long and in-depth studies, each in their own right. I thought this time around we could take a nice lighter jaunt in studying these colors with a loose bird sketch. And I know the last two videos on the channel, not specifically the series, but the channel, have included birds, so my sincere apologies if you are tired of seeing them, but I for one never get tired of painting them, so I hope you like them. I wanted to use as many mixes as I could without overdoing the overall cohesion of the piece, so I decided on Gouldian Finches. These birds feature a rainbow of colors, but also provide the opportunity to show off neutrals. This endangered species is found in northern Australia. While writing the script for this video, I learned that I ended up painting a pair of male finches. The males of the species have a deep purple chest, while the females' chests are lighter like a dusty mauve or lavender. Also super cool, the heads of either sex can be red, like the ones in this sketch, or yellow or black. I love getting to learn new things about animals through art and these videos. My rendition of the first bird that is facing forward is fine, but I really love how this second one turned out. I thought that having two birds on the page would make for a more interesting study, so I used two separate references and combined them into one composition. I felt like this was a really great compromise to show off all the lovely yellows, purples, and greens on the birds equally. Plus, the quinacridone rose and cobalt teal still have a chance to make appearances in their own pure forms near the heads. I kept things deliberately loose with that Casaneo brush until the very end of the painting, keeping the values of my washes more suggestive than literal translations of the photographs. Being looser in my painting style has been a goal of mine for years, actually. I love when I see other artists using bold, expressive strokes, but my work tends to be more controlled, sometimes bordering on overworked, especially when it comes to softening off certain edges. I enjoy working in both styles, but getting more comfortable and confident with my brushstrokes is something that I have valued for a really long time. Therefore, I am always happy to play around and explore with them, especially in my sketchbooks. After I laid down the bold colors in the first wash, I spent a bit more time on the lighter values like the shadows in the white areas of the feathers, underneath the tail, and the diluted tones on the beak and legs. Once that first layer is dry, we can go in with a second layer to really embellish those darker values to better suggest the roundness of the bird's bodies. I felt this was especially important on the purple and yellow areas of the chest in that first bird, as the chest fills such an expansive area of the sketch. We don't want it to all just be one big flat color, or at least I don't in this particular study. I dropped the first layer in on the branches using a mixture of all three colors. If you're newer to color mixing, I'll note here that the brown branches, the lighter grays on the feathers, and the darker blacks of the tails all use all three colors of this limited palette, just in different ratios. The brown branches have more of the pink and yellow in them to make them lean warmer, while the grays and blacks have more of the teal to lean cooler. As I mentioned earlier, all three of these colors can be bullies, so if you don't get the mix right on your first or second try, I didn't either, just keep trying and you will get there eventually. It's just a fine balance. Another area that needed some definition were the faces. Vivid colors like this red tend to photograph a little bit flat, so looking at the reference for guidance, I wanted to play up some of those shadows on the face, or just like turning up the contrast, so to speak. I placed the dark border around the head, and then using more of the quinacridone rose, I allowed some of these strokes to touch so that the darker paint could gradually flow into the areas that were more red. One area I struggled with to color match with this limited palette was on this wing. If I had a full studio palette in front of me, I might have given up and reached for another color like phthalo turquoise to get the color that I wanted more quickly. However, working with a limited palette helps you learn how to problem solve not only through color mixing, but also in looking at how colors relate to other colors in your painting. Working in a looser style with a limited palette means that we can get close enough that the painting looks perfectly fine in its own right, even if it doesn't perfectly match the reference. After all, we are learning what this particular color palette is capable of on its own. We can note that this is a limitation to be aware of for future paintings, but it doesn't have to be detrimental to our study. And stopping ourselves from including additional colors can make our work more cohesive overall. I would love to hear what you think about this palette, so let me know what it inspires you to paint. I hope that all of you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Due to everything with Cricut, I am behind with my videos yet again. This video is actually the limited color palette for May and June over on Patreon, which means that July's limited palette will be coming at you real soon so that we don't fall further behind. If you would like a sneak peek at this month's colors and to join our monthly community challenge, come visit over us on Patreon and our Patreon Discord. Thank you so much to my patrons for helping to support me and the channel, and thank you to you for watching this video all the way to the end. I will see you in the next video, and until then, happy painting.